Jeanette Rawls wrote The Glass Castle as a narrative. She recounted her past experiences and told her life story in the book. Her writing style throughout the book was very descriptive and allows the reader to vicariously experience Jeanette Rawls' life. Jeanette Rawls uses her descriptive writing style immediately to engage the reader on page 3 when she says, "Mom stood 15 feet away. She had tied rags around her shoulders to keep out the spring chill. Mom's gestures were all familiar, the way she tilted her head and thrust out her lower lip when studying items of potential value that she'd hoisted up out of the dumpster, the way her eyes widened with childish glee when she found something she liked." The vivid description Rawls uses to describe her mom depicts the inferior conditions Rosemary is in, while humanizing her by describing her expressions. Rawls continues to use descriptive writing style to convey the personality of our characters, like on page 131 when she says, "Irma ushered us into the kitchen, where she was fixing dinner. A bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting a harsh light on the yellowed walls, which were coated with a thin film of grease. Irma stuck a curved steel handle into an iron disc on top of an old coal cooking stove, lifted it, and with the other hand grabbed a poker from the wall and jabbed at the hot orange coals inside." Rawls uses descriptive words like jabbed and harsh to create an unpleasant feeling when Irma is in the story. She does this so the reader shares the same feelings towards Irma that she felt. Jeanette Rawls organizes her book in large sections based on where she lived. Her book does not have chapters, but instead sections. The first section is called A Woman on the Street. This section is very short and takes place when Jeanette Rawls is grown up and living in New York. Jeanette sees her homeless mother and says on page 3, "I was overcome with panic that she'd see me and call out my name." This section was about Jeanette's feelings of embarrassment about her parents' situation. Section 2 is called The Desert. This section is about Jeanette's childhood moving around the desert. It begins when Jeanette is 3 years old. Throughout this section, the Rawls family moves around to different desert mining towns in Nevada, Arizona, and California. Jeanette describes her young childhood as being a wild adventure in the desert, like when she says on page 21, "I loved the desert too. When the sun was in the sky, the sand would be so hot it would burn your feet if you were the kind of kid who wore shoes. But since we always went barefoot, our soles were as tough and thick as cowhide." In this section, their family continues to move to the Mojave Desert, Blythe, Battle Mountain, and Grandma Smith's adobe house in Phoenix when Jeanette is 10 years old. In the third section of the book, called Welch, the Rawls family situation starts to get worse when they move to Welch, West Virginia. They are motivated to move because Jeanette states on page 123, "With Dad drinking again and no money coming in, Mom began to talk about moving east to West Virginia where Dad's parents lived. Maybe his parents would help keep him in line." Jeanette describes their poor living conditions in Welch and the struggle to get through the winter when she says on page 176, "It got so cold in the house that icicles hung from the kitchen ceiling, the water in the sink turned into a solid block of ice, and the dirty dishes were stuck there as if they'd been cemented in place." This section ends when Jeanette leaves her life in Welch behind after high school to go to New York. Section 4 is called New York City. Jeanette moves to New York and lives with her sister Lori. In this section, Jeanette pursues an education, as stated on page 150, "I applied to its sister college, Barnard, and was accepted." A few years after Jeanette, Brian, and Lori moved, their parents moved to New York. They ended up living on the streets or squatting in abandoned apartments. Jeanette describes the death of her father while in New York on page 280 when she says, "2 weeks later, Dad had a heart attack." The final section of the book is called Thanksgiving. Jeanette describes her new life living in the country, married to her second husband, John. In this section, she recounts a Thanksgiving where her family happily reunited when she says on page 285, "Mom hugged me, then Lori hugged me, and I introduced John." I was initially kind of shocked when I began reading the book. The book begins with Jeanette recounting a time when she was 3 and was cooking herself lunch and caught fire. The independence of 3-year-old Jeanette was very shocking, and her parents' loose parenting style caught me off guard. As the book progressed, I continued to be shocked by the children's independence and how the parent-child roles were reversed. On page 187, Jeanette says, "Mom, you have to leave Dad." Jeanette is almost parenting her own mother by giving her advice in an attempt to improve their family's life. I was also a bit startled by the parents' contentment in living the way they were. There seemed to be a lot of opportunities for Rosemary and Rex to improve their life and overcome poverty. Like the land Rosemary owned she could have sold for a lot of money, the diamond ring she refused to sell, and her teaching degree. Despite these opportunities, they always seemed to have an excuse for not pursuing these endeavors. I believe that Jeanette's purpose for writing this book is to explain that everybody's circumstances in life are much different, so judging people living in poverty is very wrong and misguided. Jeanette says on page 256, after her friend tells her not to give homeless people money because they are scam artists, "What do you know?" I wanted to ask. I felt like telling Carol that my parents were out there too, that she had no idea what it was like to be down on your luck with nowhere to go and nothing to eat. This quote really summarizes what Jeanette wants the audience to understand from her story. She wants people to treat the less fortunate with empathy rather than judgment and disgust. I feel like Jeanette Walls embodies the self-determination theory and portrays it throughout the book. For example, on page 116, Jeanette asks her father, "Do you think you could maybe stop drinking?" Jeanette recognizes that her father's behavior is harming the well-being of her family. She expresses self-determination when asking her father this question because she is trying to take control of her family's situation and improve it. She has taken the responsibility to try and guide her family's future, which she does frequently throughout the book. She also shows self-determination when she tells her mom to leave her dad on page 187, because she is actively trying to improve her family situation by having control. Jeanette also shows intrinsic regulation, which is part of the self-determination theory. For example, on page 203, Jeanette says, "I loved the newsroom's purposeful atmosphere." She also states on page 231, "Even though the wave came out only once a month, I worked on it every day." Jeanette embodies this factor of self-determination, which is manifested in her dedication for writing her school's newspaper. Self-determination is very prominent in the ending of The Glass Castle, when Jeanette begins to focus on saving herself. On page 235, Jeanette tells her counselor, "I want to go to New York." Even with the disapproval of her counselor, Jeanette is set on moving and works hard to earn money. Jeanette expresses self-determination because she is taking control of her own future, even though it is challenging and her goals defy what people think she should be doing. I feel like Jeanette Walls was such a self-determined individual because of the environment she grew up in. In an interview with Motherhood in Hollywood with Heather Brooker, Jeanette says,
especially with my mother, she just, I wasn't going to get parenting there. She wasn't going to make food for us. She wasn't going to take care of us. She wasn't going to dress us. We just, real early on, I learned to take care of myself.
Because, as Jeanette said, her mother and father did not provide the basic needs that most parents provide for their children. It forced Jeanette to be independent from a young age so she could survive in her environment. This independence and knowledge of how to take care of herself from a young age caused Jeanette to grow up into an independent, self-determined woman. Jeanette did not rely on her parents, which allowed her to take control of her own future and move to New York to pursue a job and an education. I also believe the harsh reality of her environment, the hunger she had to endure, the discomfort she had to deal with while living in a run-down house and trying to stay warm in the winter, dramatically shaped Jeanette Walls and was part of why she was very driven. All of the pain and suffering she had to deal with while living in poverty motivated her to try to improve her situation so she could escape the pain of how they were living. Finally, I believe Jeanette's environment growing up shaped her to become a compassionate person. For example, on page 256, Jeanette is walking down a street with a fellow student and she gave a homeless man change. Her friend told her that she should not do that and that all homeless people are scam artists. Jeanette then states, "What do you know?" I wanted to ask. I felt like telling Carol that my parents were out there too. Jeanette's environment growing up and living life in poverty gave her a unique perspective in life. Her compassion towards homeless people derived from her own experiences struggling to survive.